everyone, welcome and thanks for joining us today. I'm Kathryn Last, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be your host for this conversation. Today we're joined by members of the Rainbow Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, Glynnis Lieb, Seon Yuzyk, Micah Rajunov, and Jin Marshall. Together they're part of a powerful project exploring what it means to build inclusive, affirming, and sustainable resources for 2S LGBTQI+ entrepreneurs. In this episode, we'll be talking about the work behind the scenes, what inspired the project, and what we are learning about equity, innovation, and community in entrepreneurship. Before we begin, could each panelist please introduce yourself, outline your role within the Rainbow Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and share what drew you to this work?
Why, thank you, Kate. I appreciate it. And so my name is Glynnis Lieb, she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Firefly Institute for Sexual and Gender Diversity at the University of Alberta. And we've been around doing really leadership and self-esteem building with youth for a long time. And so when we saw the request for proposals for this project, it seemed like a natural next step for queer and trans folk in general. And I thought it was a great opportunity to actually look at how do we do something constructive and provide tangible things for members of our communities across the country beyond youth into adulthood. So I thought it was a great fit for us.
Hi, my name is Jin Marshall. I use they, he pronouns, and I'm the project manager of the Rainbow Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. I'm also a PhD student at York University, and I'm delighted to be working together with the project, and I'll pass it on to Seon.
Hi, I'm Seon Yuzyk, doctoral candidate at the University of Alberta, and I am the community-based lead for the project, and we're overseeing research trying to change the ecosystem on queer entrepreneurship in Canada. My research is helping people understand the origins and perseverance of racial capitalism in Canada, and my pronouns are he, him. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Micah.
Hello, my name is Micah Rajunov. I am the postdoctoral fellow for the REKH Hub project. I work at the University of Alberta Business School, and my research focuses on what work means to us. So I was recruited for the project in part because of my research, but also in part because of my history with trans health advocacy. So this really brought it back home to me. It's both professional and personal. I focus on the academic research portion of the project, and this involves fieldwork trips to different regions of Canada and interviews with queer entrepreneurs to understand their lived experience and the opportunities that they have in being entrepreneurs.
This project, it's looking within queer and trans communities across the country for just the talent and the strengths that we have within is particularly timely right now because, of course, we and other places around the globe are seeing that pushback and rise in homophobia and transphobia, like we're seeing a rise in hate crimes in general. Unfortunately, in this time of great struggle and political game playing, I guess to say. And so it was really great opportunity to kind of work around that and really focus on that strengths-based perspective within our community. And the idea behind this project is coming at it from emancipatory entrepreneurship, which is Dr. Michael Lunsbury's baby. He's a co-PI for this project, but it's about looking beyond just how do we make the next CEO. It's about how do we redefine who we think of and who thinks of themselves as entrepreneurial and creative, and how do we understand their experiences in different communities and places across the country. And it's really about removing barriers and creating opportunities for people to work in a way that's self-sustaining, but also allows them to thrive and enjoy life.
Could the panel please share the vision behind the creation of the Rainbow Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and speak to why this initiative is especially timely in Canada's current economic and social landscape?
The project was inspired by the federal action plan that was developed in 2022 to basically improve the economic, social, and political conditions of queer folks across Canada. And this team has been traveling around the country to really envision and re-envision what queer lives could look like within the present context.
I'll speak a little to my perspective and understanding of the current economic and social landscape, because I'm actually based in the United States, not based in Canada. So I'm new to Canada and understanding the politics and what's going on. And as we all know, in the US, queer discourse has been weaponized. We're being used as cultural pawns in the political game. We're the demons, we're the enemy. And I think, it's a different country, but there's still a lot of spillover in terms of the discourse and the politics into Canada. I'm very lucky that my grant is from Canada, because if it were in the US, it would have been canceled and I would have been out of a job. But we're still seeing the effects here in Canada. And this has come up a lot in our fieldwork and interviews as current policies are being implemented. We saw in Alberta, there was a big regressive trans youth policy that has happened. So I think, coming in from the US, I thought Canada was much, much, much more progressive, but we're still seeing the spillover effects and the backwardness that is going on. So it becomes even more important. We can't take any of this for granted.
The taking for granted piece, I think that sometimes as you're speaking, as everyone's been speaking, I've been thinking how remarkable it is that we have a team that's predominantly queer folk and really strong allies who are working on the project. So we are in our positionality meeting others of the same positionality who are entrepreneurs trying to fight within the political systems and also make a life and make a living, right?
Just to build off of what you said, Jen, I think that the project at least is helping me see that queer justice, it exists outside the courtroom. So when laws on inclusion and all this stuff happens, that's wonderful. But the sort of moral compass that exists, that circulates and narrates the boundaries of our lives, continues to live outside of those laws. Like when we go on social media, when we go into stores and we have to deal with, those negative, derogatory comments, the hate speech, all those things come together to impact our lives. And so this sort of community work, this national project is really trying to also address those moral compasses that have been inherited from a very, very long time ago.
Absolutely. And I think part of the meaningfulness of this project, as Jen mentioned, is it's mostly run by queer folk, mostly employing queer people. And it really takes a stand in terms of demonstrating our capacity to build something meaningful by us and for us that has a ripple effect, not just, I think, for queer entrepreneurs, but in how we redefine entrepreneurship itself and hopefully impacts other communities as well.
One more thing I wanted to mention about that is that also we're committed to racial diversity. We don't want, like we often see in the academy, to be a group of white folks hiring white folks, promoting white folks. We're really taking a stand to make sure that our project, the people in it, and the people we serve are not predominantly cis, white, heteropatriarchal folks.
Exactly. And I think that really shows in the intersectional lens that we use, the sort of methodologies that we draw on, the people that sit on our advisory committees, the strategic meetings that we have, the conferences that we've planned. Like we've been very intentional about who sits at that table. And I think that it sits as a model for what future projects could look like.
So intersectionality has always been, from the very beginning, part of our project, which I think is what makes it unique. It's not just about queer people. We've also focused on underrepresented communities within the queer community. We've been very intentional in including racial diversity, rural communities. We've traveled to the north, francophone communities, immigrant communities. And as Seon mentioned, it's part of our advisory council. It's part of who we meet in support organizations. And it's part of the entrepreneurs we recruit to be participants in our studies and research, and also who we invited to the conference and who is just represented overall. And this is a question we always ask ourselves, and we are very deliberate and intentional in doing that.
And for folks that don't know what intersectionality is, it's a life. It is lived experiences at multiple sites of oppression, if you want to call it that. But these are lived, embodied stories. They're narratives. You don't necessarily pick it up in a textbook. And that's what we're trying to bring in, like people's lived experiences and how that actually can and should shape policy.
And I think I could give an example of something that has come up as being very intersectional is we were interviewing and talking to an organization, the 519 in Toronto, that has a program for newcomers and queer refugees and immigrants. And oftentimes they come from countries and communities and cultures that are very conservative and are not accepting of queer identities. And so what happens is people are torn between these two communities that they belong to. You know, do they affiliate themselves with the queer community? Or do they affiliate themselves with their community of origin where they might have to go back into the closet? And specifically for queer refugees, the trouble that they run into is to prove their refugee status, they have to demonstrate, danger about being queer. So they have to be out. But then that means being excluded from their community of origin. And they are really at this crossroads. And that is, I think, what exemplifies intersectionality is that it's more than just the sum of the parts. It's more than just belonging to two communities at once. It's feeling the tensions between them. It's feeling the belonging of one community or another, and often having to choose.
When we talk about intersectionality, a big part of this project has been focusing on hearing and learning from Indigenous peoples across this country. And I think that's a very humbling experience because that's, of course, a very tangible and complex conversation in this country because many folk have been forced to, live lives where since colonization, they've had to be apologetic or choose or been ostracized because of the communities they come from. Now there's the messaging around gender and sexual diversity and being brought into this conversation by, folks who are, many of us are settlers and, we're part of the problem in the first place, coming into a place where people understood sexual and gender diversity far more than we did. And now we're coming back and saying, oh, you shouldn't be homophobic, you shouldn't be transphobic when we taught those things. So we've been really, really fortunate to have some great leadership from Indigenous peoples in a bunch of different places as we've gone through this project in the last couple of years. There's a whole lot of conversation to be had here. And a lot of the time I feel like what's happening in this project and what we're learning about are things, again, that we're saying things people already knew for a long time in lots of ways. But it's a privilege to be part of, I guess, re-examining or bringing to the surface these conversations.
From your perspectives, what are the most significant systemic barriers currently impacting 2S LGBTQI+ entrepreneurs across Canada?
I'll jump in here again. I think that this idea of who is an entrepreneur, and that's something that we've really challenged with this project and getting beyond the cis, often white CEO of a company and understanding what does it mean to be actually entrepreneurial and creative. And so many times we're encountering people who don't consider themselves to be entrepreneurial. And from the start in this project, we didn't define what entrepreneur was or entrepreneurial because we wanted people to kind of check themselves in if they wanted to and leave that quite open. And that's a systemic, it's a funding barrier. If you're young, if you're an artisan, or an artist, whatever it is that you're doing to creatively support yourself, there's this idea that you have to, have certain things in check before you can ask for support, ask for money. And so, again, we often exclude people or box people out based on those things. And so it's that narrow impression of what an entrepreneur is that is held by, unfortunately, many people, including funders and banks and so forth.
From my perspective as a political scientist, I think one of the incredible challenges for the queer community right now is this notion of multiculturalism that sits at the heart of Canadianism. And this is challenging because it has put forward ideas of immense inclusivity and also created the perception that Canada doesn't have homophobia, racism, transphobia, and all these other isms that we come across. But in fact, we do, and it lives very well. And as we move through literature, conversations with folks across the country, these things surface even more. And I wanted to build earlier Micah's point on the refugees and when they arrive here. I think as part of intersectionality as well is that we need to expand our vision beyond nationalism and think about how queer folks are moving from points A, B, and C internationally. That intersectionality, it moves past borders, and we need to be mindful of that. When queer refugees arrive in Canada, they in fact experience racism and transphobia. They, in fact, cannot be fully integrated into their communities. Some, they, as Micah said, have to choose whether they're going to be, out with their communities or continue to stay within their home communities, their culture that's here in Canada. And most folks, when they come, they're looking to integrate and be with folks that kind of look like them or speak their language, share the same food and ideas and so on. And that's a complicated process. So structurally in itself, it's not only the outside that we need to worry about. Mm-hmm. We need to figure out how we can make folks feel safe when they're here and not in the face of violence, even when their communities are coming from all over the world.
Yes, and in terms of multiple marginalization, what happens within the institutions that are providing resources is that people are confused as to which they belong to. Sometimes they have to, quote unquote, prove their status, prove that their business is queer-owned when they might not want to be out as a queer-owned business, or prove that they are of Indigenous ancestry, and how can they do that? Sometimes they're not sure if they qualify for a certain grant aimed at a specific identity or minority, and that's part of navigating these very complex systems. Another
barrier is the lack of data on queerness across, I would say, the world. When we look at some of the 5 top journals in political science, we see that there's a minuscule percentage of content that's published on queerness. So we, in fact, don't know much. And what we have to do as part of this project is generate data to actually be able to measure and understand and change the conditions of people's lives in the country.
Mm. And I think our colleague, Randy Wimmer, who's working on a very comprehensive scoping literature review, mentioned that they started with 6,000 articles that met the criteria for queer entrepreneurship as search terms. And when they really dug into them, they whittled it down to only 120 academic articles across all databases and all disciplines that met the criteria speaking to queer entrepreneurship. And 120 is really not a great number to start with as data.
On the note of barriers and whose voices get heard, we heard at the 519 and in other places about how central services are great, but rural communities don't have the same access to services, don't have the same access to having voices heard. And if those communities are studied, it's more appropriative and exploitative than it is in central areas where there are lots of queer folk. So our project is looking at not just supporting the people who are already supported in central areas and central urban areas, but looking outside of those areas to the rural areas and the northern regions across the country to service 2S LGBTQI plus entrepreneurs and give them what they need to succeed.
And the Francophone community, language came up as a huge barrier as well in translating these resources.
Yes.
That focus on rural-urban is so important because, as we've seen in the federal action plan, especially older queer folks are going back into the closet when they have to receive service from any sort of healthcare professional. These are things that are pushing folks back in the closet. That's a problem. When you're a retired person looking to enjoy the rest of your life, the last thing you want is to be concealing significant aspects of your life. And that's what people are experiencing today.
Considering generations, I've talked to older queer entrepreneurs who are retired and started their business after retirement. And it's sort of the opposite. They had to be closeted their whole career. And suddenly they're able to be out. And this is, we talk about constraints, but our project also focuses on opportunities and liberation and authenticity and entrepreneurship as self-determination. And I think this person was a great example of that, is like, finally, I can be myself. I can give back to my community. I can provide mentorship as a queer person and queer entrepreneur.
On the note of mentorship, we need more mentorship programs, especially for queer youth in this country. There's about a handful. At the University of Alberta, we created a mentorship program that could offer, service gaps for Black youth, Black queer youth as well, so that there's space available. Most of these youth don't have the space to talk about political issues that are happening in their lives. And so creating these, you want to say safe spaces, but spaces where people can just talk and be themselves, whatever that looks like. We need more of those.
Mm-hmm. Another systemic barrier that has come up, and this one runs deep, is the historical disenfranchisement and exclusion from mainstream institutions that create disadvantages from the very beginning. So, for instance, there's a lack of intergenerational wealth, especially in non-white communities or immigrant communities. So they don't have access to financial capital. They don't have access to financial literacy and knowledge. And so just before the race even begins, they're already at a disadvantage. They don't have the education. They don't have the networks. Even when they try to access these mainstream institutions, they are excluded. There's bias, obviously, but when they are included, they don't see themselves represented. Speaking of mentorship, they are not mentored by people who represent them and understand their experiences. They feel sometimes that they're tokenized even. They are the one diversity person in an entrepreneurship accelerator. And so there's sort of, lip service and marketing about how wonderful we are, but they're really not feeling supportive. And so this historical exclusion just carries forward through the process of entrepreneurship as they keep building their businesses.
One thing, Micah, I think when you say folks don't have the education, what we do know is that lots of newcomers to Canada have loads of education, but it's not recognized here. So folks have to start from scratch.
Well, they don't know how to navigate the system.
Yes, they aren't able to, aren't given access to the system.
I think what Seon said is we think of nationalism, you come to Canada, how do grants work? How do systems work? You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what networks are available. Yeah. And this actually came up as a very big irony in Toronto, for instance, where we think of urban. Toronto has a huge amount of resources, but a lot of people said, I don't even know where to begin. I don't feel like I can build a network because everybody already has their own network. Everybody already belongs. Where do I even start to begin to feel included? There's sort of this paradox of too much information and too many resources, and people aren't sure how to even start to access them.
Well, I would also say that the resources are incredibly centralized. And when we look at the resources that are available to support queer refugees, it's primarily in Toronto. So, for example, coming from Alberta, where are queer refugees supported in Alberta? I am not sure. And it might actually exist, but the resources are incredibly centralized and it needs to be spread out a bit more. When queer folks have to do anything relating to our community, we need to do it downtown. And that's a problem. That's a problem in terms of accessibility, cost, and most folks, depending on your socioeconomic background, cannot afford to be downtown, especially in the prime areas. So, yeah, I just wanted to add that.
There is Rainbow Railroad in BC, so we've got centers of newcomer support in BC and Ontario. But those are two of the most inaccessible cities to reside in from north to south, east to west.
And that's wonderful. And look at the political conditions in Alberta.
Yes.
So the places that need them most are critically lacking. And we need it in Alberta.
Yes.
Like right now, today.
Where do you see the largest gaps within traditional entrepreneurship and small business support ecosystems when it comes to serving 2S LGBTQI+ founders?
It's been interesting in this project because, again, we didn't want to make any assumptions about what people's experiences were or assume that people's experiences were the same in different parts of the country. So we've had different answers in different places, and our research experts here can speak a lot to specific findings. But the conversation we were just having picks up on a lot of this. When we look at identifying what services and supports exist out there, of course, there's a dearth of services that are overtly focused on supporting members of queer and trans communities and entrepreneurship in many places. But also, there are services that advertise themselves as such and then aren't necessarily. But there are lots of services and supports that don't formally advertise, but you have people who are informally prioritizing or creating pathways for people too. And so part of what we're trying to find out is, who are and what are the natural supports in different communities for queer entrepreneurs that exist there? What do those look like? That might be a group of seniors who are helping youth get started or something like that, that aren't on paper as a formal program. This idea of having to find programming, I stand on a soapbox about this a lot because we've come to this place where we've gotten so far away from natural community because we've been socialized away from knowing our neighbors and knowing who people are and believing that only formal programs with people who are formally trained can actually be proper supports or actually, funded, etc. And so part of this project is that community piece. And with that, the database that we've been creating is about tracking that networking. And, I know Cindy in St. John's knows how to do this piece and is part of the community, and I can ask her for this and, those kinds of things. And so there are lots of supports and people who have the ability to help others get started from all experiences within our communities across the country. And we're trying to find who those are. And I think that, understanding and kind of broadening our understanding of what's out there, that sense of real community and lots of people, as we've said today, again, for various reasons. The best way to find out, what exists and what actually works is talking to people.
That's definitely come up in our academic research is the fragmented and uncoordinated resources. So there might be queer supporting organization that has, an entrepreneurship accelerator. And then there's a Francophone organization that has a financial literacy program. And they're really not talking to each other. And so they have these curriculum, they have these supports, but they don't know that each other exists. And I think that's one of the biggest roles that the REKH is trying to play is meet all these community partners, find them at where they are and trying to connect them and build these lasting partnerships so that they can begin to form a larger community that is more than the sum of its parts and try and get people not just the resources that they need, but pool these resources so that we can build off of each other and build something bigger.
I think that one of the largest gaps within traditional entrepreneurship starts within the classroom, whether that's in high school, undergrad, master's, executive level. It's in the classroom. Students are not taught to think about social issues on a deeper critical level within business schools. When we analyzed on the community-based team, we looked at textbooks to see how are discussions about entrepreneurship being carried out, and they are profoundly grounded in competition. Competition has guided the entire field, and competition is anti-queer because queer communities have utilized a sense of communal knittedness, togetherness, in order to survive within context of violence. And so when we center that communal aspect, that is in fact queerness. That's what I see. And so we need to introduce that back into the ecosystem and how we survive.
Yeah, on that note, Seon, it makes me think of one of the greatest models of entrepreneurship that is never studied, that is the oldest profession on the planet, and that has successful models of entrepreneurship, which is sex work.
Yes.
There are lots and lots of models of how entrepreneurship, self-employment work, but because of bias, because of exploitation, they aren't studied, they aren't seen as valid and viable ways of doing entrepreneurship.
And sex is political and it needs to be governed. And we've seen this in historical processes. States have always been interested in our sex.
Are you saying it needs to be governed? Or are you saying the politicians and the governments need to govern it?
I'm saying that politicians and capitalists definitely don't want sex and sexuality to be something freeing and liberating. It needs to be structured for reproductive purposes. And if reproduction is not centered, then it is, quote unquote, unproductive behavior. So sexuality and governance is really tying in the cultures of entrepreneurship as well, and what determines the boundaries of acceptability, what we can say, think, and do in business and in politics.
Well, and I want to talk about what looks as like a legitimate business, a legitimate product, a legitimate service. And one of the other gaps that has come up is access to capital. So first, what Seon says is, who is an entrepreneur? What does entrepreneurship look like? And when you're pitching to an investor, if you are not a white, cis, hetero male, you do not look like an entrepreneur. They don't trust you. A lot of investment goes to a founding team that they believe in. It's very subjective. And if you don't look like the model entrepreneur, which has been built in since the very beginning in the classroom, then they won't trust that you'll be successful. But the second thing that I've found is queer-specific products, queer-specific services, inclusive spaces, say someone who's producing binders for trans people and clothes and garments, or fitness coaching for trans people. The investors say this product is too niche. There's not a market for it, and we don't want to fund it because there's not enough people who are going to buy into it, or it's not scalable. And so the queer community isn't seen as a legitimate market with legitimate needs that need to be filled.
Which in Canada now is a growing business, given that binders and people who sell those sorts of things, that's illegal business now in the US. I wanted to come back to something that Glynnis often speaks about. I wanted to come back to you and drawing on what you had said, Seon, about talking about when we talked about sex work and talking about the work part of it, but there's also, you brought in sex and the pleasure part of it. And so I wanted to talk about pleasure and queer joy, which is something that Glynnis is often talking about as something that we should focus on in entrepreneurship and in business and in the project, and something that our communities often don't focus on.
And again, it's not just only within the queer community, but this paternalistic kind of charity idea that people with the most power and reach often have. Where you donate your ripped clothes to charity and you're like, well, they should be grateful for this,
They
can't possibly have opinions about their fashion because they're poor. And this idea when people are under-resourced, underemployed, should take what you get and settle, that sort of thing. And so again, this conversation about, it's not just, well, you should take what opportunity you can get. It's about, how do we think about sustaining ourselves in a way that actually is satisfying and brings joy into, in our lives in some way? And often that's not talked about in business in general anyway, because, right? It's like, how do you get the money? How do you make the money? But this, again, like, how do we actually create a sustainable existence for ourselves in a way that also allows us to enjoy life? And I think this is really important now. And I know we were just talking about this in a conversation, I think yesterday, is, not only as we look around the rooms in queer contexts, but even as we look at the reality that we exist in right now. I mean, I come from organized labor background. I have kids who are entering into the workforce. And when I look at my kids and their friends, first of all, there's not this like, oh, the world is my oyster if I just graduate kind of thing. But we do have a generation of youth now who do choose other things over money, like choose comfort and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of that is, about questioning things, but also that there's not this perception that if I just find my job at 18, I'm going to be good till I retire anymore. That's not real. And like, none of my kids are saying, I want to go into this profession, this and that. They all have this idea that they're going to have to find their own way financially some way. So I think we need to be having these conversations. What does that, it's about more than just eking out a living, right?
Mm-hmm.
A big part of the resources and the gaps that are there is that we're trying to redefine entrepreneurship away from money and profit. And something that comes up in these support organizations very often is psychological resources and emotional resources and providing resilience and self-esteem and self-confidence. And it goes back to celebrating the queer joy, going back to our roots of how we have been such a resilient community, through cooperation, and integrating that into our entrepreneurship journey.
There's this added gap in terms of how queer folks are pictured, and there's this notion of the rich gays, and
Oh, yeah.
and I think the irony behind this notion of the rich gay is that the report on queer livability in Canada, published in 2022, actually shows some troubling insights. Higher levels of suicide, sexual violence, economic precarity, and all these things existing within our community at vastly accelerating rates. But this notion of the rich gay emerges precisely when the economic situations of queer folks are dwindling. I think that's really problematic.
REKH Csea places a strong emphasis on being community-led and community-engaged. Could the panel discuss how this approach is operationalized in your programs and partnerships?
Well, one of the things that we've approached academic research through, and this is actually pretty uncommon, at least in my field, is a community-centered, community-oriented practice. So we got this grant money to build an entrepreneurship knowledge hub, and we didn't say this is what an entrepreneurship knowledge hub should look like. This is what we're building. We said, what is an entrepreneurship knowledge hub? What is a knowledge hub? What is entrepreneurship? We started from the bottom up, and I was part of the REKH mobile team where we traveled to 14 different regions in Canada and met with these partner organizations, met with individual queer entrepreneurs to listen to their lived experiences and really get a sense of what are the questions we should be asking. Not even what answers do we want, but we don't know what we don't know. And that's the place where we started at. And I think that reflects our orientation towards at least the research side of it, but also just building the project as a whole.
I think that our model of the REKH mobile team really does this well. We went to communities and we listened. We heard. We didn't research immediately. We didn't do formal research, but we were led. And I think that model started at Queer Yukon, which is really a huge success story of our collaboration and our community efforts in the project. But we went and we listened, we were guided, and we also built relationships. Those relationships aren't always talked about in a business process or in research. We really built friendships. And those are what sustained us to move forward throughout all the regions and then to do really great research.
I think that's so beautifully said. Something magical happens, and I get goosebumps talking about it. Something magical happens when you put people in a room with such similar interlocking experiences. Like, you're seen on a level that you haven't been seen before. And I think that that's really special. We saw that at the conference that we organized in November 2025, where community members came in and folks were sharing about their lives, their work on the ground. And it was so humbling as an academic, just reading articles and so on that's cool. And there's a lot to be gained from reading a journal article. But there's also a significant amount of teaching and learning that comes from communities' stories. And I think this is also an important way to decolonize research and bring Indigenous oral traditions within the architecture of entrepreneurship, because they're also here too, and they're also building with us. And I think that that's a beautiful part of knowledge, really mobilization and sharing and listening.
In terms of knowledge mobilization, one big theme that we've tried to do, or at least one approach with our hub fieldwork trips was connection. So a great example is our first trip was to the Yukon. We met with Queer Yukon. And we had a wonderful liaison, shout out to Calhoun Keating Malay, who introduced us to all these wonderful people there. But then when we had our trip to Yellowknife, Calhoun also organized a lot of meetings there. And it really showed this connection of the North as a region and not just the Yukon and Yellowknife and Northwest Territories, but really the shared experiences that they have in the North and sort of thinking of them as a connected, interlocking region that shares differences, but also has similar experiences and similar barriers and similar opportunities that we identified.
Community-based research, we're looking to really understand political culture in a different way and the political cultures of money in a different way. And one way in which we did that was we executed focus groups across the country. And we asked queer entrepreneurs, draw me an entrepreneur. This is a technique coming out from the Common Ground study at the University of Alberta with Jared Wesley's team. And we say, draw me an entrepreneur, to see the sort of assumptions, underlying assumptions that are there in terms of what people think constitute a entrepreneur. Kathryn and I today, we're actually going to be decoding that information, analyzing it to see what we can get. But it moves us from behind the screen, behind our phones, and brings us into communities. And in a way, like the drawing is a bit of play, and we learn a lot through play. And I think that technique, as well as a community-based research tool, brought people together in a unique way. People argued, oh, I'm not Picasso, I can't draw. But it's the art that led to connection and storytelling that I found really beautiful and generative.
So interesting having the research come to life in the podcast. Micah, you mentioned the conference. Glynnis and I would love to give a gratitude out, and all of us, to Two Spirits in Motion, and particularly Paulette, for giving us the spiritual guidance within a pipe ceremony for the conference that was so incredibly transformative and kind and grounded us in the things that really matter in life and in entrepreneurship. And it was such a gift that some of us had never been to a pipe ceremony before, and it really shifted the focus back onto the things that are really important, the things that matter, the things that ground us, the things that are true, and gave us that grounding. And it was such a gift, right, Glynnis?
Yes, absolutely.
First conference I've ever cried at. I'm like, no one look at me, because it was just so beautiful. It was a spiritual experience for me, and other folks that were in the room. You could just feel the energy was really palpable. And I think you folks really organized something special that will sit with me for the rest of my academic career.
How does REKH Csea ensure representation and inclusion of diverse identities and lived experiences across the 2S spectrum, particularly in rural, remote, and underrepresented communities?
Last summer, 2025, we initiated a process of using Grindr as a mode of outreach to communities. And it sounded strange before to use a hookup app to meet community, but we did it and we were successful in doing so. For example, in Halifax, we met a queer refugee entrepreneur who didn't live downtown. He was in a rural area and hadn't heard about the study. And like we mentioned earlier, most queer-related things they occur within the main city and the downtown areas because of the centralization of resources. But by using the app that was already stitched within the community, we were able to connect with him. We went out, we had coffee, we had such a wonderful, wonderful time. And I shared the study with him, the REKH study, and told him about an event that was happening the next day for a podcast. And we just started a whole new sort of like ecosystem just from using an app that was already part of our community and ridiculously stigmatized. But it is an effective tool for research. And I think that, of course, there's a lot of nuances around there to think about if you're going to use this sort of method, but it is generative.
A core pillar of Rekh Ciea's work is co-research and co-creation. Could you elaborate on what this means in practice and how it shapes your programming and policy recommendations?
Part of the project was, at the beginning, as Micah said, not assuming that we knew what should be asked or how things should be done. And so part of the mandate from the funder was that we enlist academic and non-academic partners across the country. And so we've done that. We have over 20 partners across the country, and many of them are taking part in research in different ways, but we let them bring to the table what they wanted to do and create as part of this project and their understanding of this project. And that, I think, has been brilliant. We've gotten so much interesting outputs, or so many interesting outputs from that, and people's different takes on what they wanted to look at or work with, or who in our communities they wanted to explore more. So I think that's been a really cool thing, and we'll be finding out more about all that in our research and symposium in March, which I'm really excited about.
Yes, and as Micah mentioned earlier, we traveled across the country and we met with entrepreneurs in person, and we asked them, what might actually influence and change the way in which you exist within the entrepreneurship ecosystem? They gave us dynamic responses. Those responses are actually what's going to be within our reports. They are the responses that we hope in the future will shape policy. And so this is community telling us what they want and what they need. And we listen and we offer it up as academics to the folks who are making the big decisions.
Glynnis brought up the funders. And I wanted to say, as we all want to say, that we have been so lucky and blessed to have incredible funders in the CQCC. Working with Tyler, Abdi, and the whole team has been transformational. It's been incredible to have this support. And we are really hoping that the funding continues beyond March so that we can continue this great work and move forward with providing to us LGBTQI plus entrepreneurs the supports and resources and communities that they are asking for.
Another big part of the hub has been knowledge dissemination, which coming from the academic research side, often we write academic research articles that go into these journals that nobody else reads. And that's very exciting. And they're written in a dense format that nobody understands, and it just circulates internally, and it really doesn't have an impact on the outside community. And, we're talking about research co-creation that is really extractive in the practices. So one thing we've tried to do is, at least on my side, I've written reports that I've sent back to the organizations that we talked to and really resonated with their experience. And they've mentioned, I can use this to get more funding. It reflects my experience. We're doing, thinking of ways of communicating our findings and our research and disseminating the data. For instance, this podcast, we've been to several conferences and presented to different audiences. And this is something that we're trying to build and hopefully can sustain in the future.
On that note, we were so delighted over Christmas that we had a researcher from Carleton write us and say, I've been enjoying all of your reports. I've been reading them, and I see this one is coming. When is it going to be here? When can I read it? And we thought, oh, wow, this knowledge is being disseminated. This knowledge is being shared. People are using it. And yesterday at a conference that we were at U of T, we talked about all of these reports and ways that people can utilize them to find out more information from north to south, east to west, nationally, about what's happening for entrepreneurs in the populations that we're looking at.
And hopefully we can get these to other outlets. I know when we traveled to Montreal, the Montreal team wrote up an article for us in Fugues magazine, and hopefully I'll get to write up different pieces in other places I've been invited, but we'll see if that turns out. But generally it's just we lack research, we lack numbers, we lack data, but we lack awareness of this. And if organizations can't use our research, then why are we doing the research at all?
Right. And I think right from the start, one of the visions that we had was by the end of this first 2 years, we'd have an idea from different regions of what things people are saying that they need or need removed or need less or more of, and be able to start identifying how to make those changes happen for people. So we are giving something back to the communities as part of this project, which of course is really important.
And informational resources are part of self-advocacy, right? These organizations are trying to scrap money together from funders, maybe lobbying for policy changes. And if they don't have the resources to do that, then how can they implement change? So we are just one small part of the chain in the change.
On that note, that reminds me of one finding that we had, which was more of a passive finding about Vancouver. And I was speaking with an entrepreneur last week, and the entrepreneur said, well, there's Vancouver, but nobody goes out, nobody goes to meetings in Vancouver. Nobody comes. And I said, that's exactly what we found when we had our networking and meeting in Vancouver that we expected would be really well attended. It's a major city, but we didn't have the folks. So we're finding these really interesting and useful regional tidbits, regional data points that are really helpful for all of us.
Yes. And when we talk about underrepresentation, I think sometimes we don't think in regions, and Canada is such a large country. And I really love the way we approached this as a regional project, because the regional differences have been really stark and we can learn through each region. So Vancouver versus Toronto was an amazing example, which is Toronto, highly centralized, highly resourced, but the paradox of too many resources. And then you go to Vancouver, the second or third largest urban center, and you would expect very similar, hugely resources. And we actually found nothing. Like nobody reached out. It was very hard for me to get interviews with people and organizations. And the one person I talked to at University of British Columbia wasn't aware of any other resources. Even within his university, it was all word of mouth. And so it's interesting that even in a large urban center, we have this lack of knowledge and lack of network and lack of resources, which you wouldn't expect. And so a lot of this has been, how can we cross-pollinate the ideas of across regions of what's working in one region? Why is it working? And how can it translate to a different region, which has a different sort of infrastructure?
Why is data collection and research so critical to building a clearer picture of the 2S LGBTQI+ entrepreneurship landscape? And how will this data be used to drive long-term change?
I think we've said a lot of this throughout the conversation already, but starting from the fact that, as Micah emphasized before, there's just such a lack of research that focuses on entrepreneurial pursuits from that queer lens. And so the fact that we have this massive scoping project, this international scoping project that's coming back and saying, we have about 120 usable articles here, I think should hopefully be a real motivator for anybody out there who is wanting to do more research and work in this field, because they can say, hey, this is needed. This is something that's necessary for me now. So, speaking to all those researchers, up and coming grad students and so forth, but also getting to what was just being said. We can say that, hey, these are the experiences that people are having in Vancouver or Toronto or Brandon, Manitoba, or these are the different things. And so if you're trying to support people, organizing a large event in downtown Vancouver is probably not going to get you what you want to do. You have to figure out some different way to meet people where they're at there. Whereas in Toronto, it might work. And going throughout the country, we saw all of these really interesting nuances, the type of work that people are interested in that they're doing in different regions, how people engage with each other. Going back to the example of the North, we talk about the North collectively, and that's really important, but also the social experience in Yukon was very different than in the Northwest Territories, and how people socialize, who they socialize with, how open, what barriers there are, again, what industries people are looking at, who kind of has a lot of social credit within queer communities and so forth. So it gives us starting points. And that gets back to something I said earlier. And we did this through the Firefly Institute with the Gay Straight Alliance Network in schools across Alberta a few years ago. It was about going into the communities and then finding out who within those communities actually has reach, credibility, those kinds of things. So for wanting to bring a resource or try a program in a specific place, who is it you need to talk to there? And again, it might not be who we assume, and different people in different places. So, so just having that nuanced knowledge that's been gained through this project and the connections and knowing who we can ask, in Gander, Newfoundland about something, I think is massively important and very empowering for doing work and empowering people to do work, whether it's programming or research, that is actually going to be needed and necessary in different areas.
To that point, we discovered a lot of communities that are over-researched, and the ways that these communities have set up their own qualifying questions and qualifying processes so that they don't spend time on exploitative research. So communities in the North, Indigenous communities, ways in which they have been over-researched and ways in which they've set up boundaries.
Well, we talk a lot about the lack of research, but I want to talk about the research that does exist. So I'm working on a paper of a review of LGBTQ literature in the work and the workplace. And what we found is overwhelmingly the research is on stigma, disclosure dilemmas in the workplace, labor market discrimination, and it's all in a deficit-based framing. It's all about the negative experiences of queer people. And again, one of the things the project is trying to focus on is this queer joy, queer resilience. What are the positive experiences? What can we learn from, for instance, social movements that have been successful? And that's, I think, where the research needs to move forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And on that note, we at the community-based segment of this project are looking at how governments across Canada is presenting queer people to the public. And we examine, I believe it's 564 images across government social media on Facebook, Instagram, X, and all the other major platforms. We found that governments are, in fact, pushing positive imagery of queer people, and I think that this is a good thing. However, they are predominantly positive, even in the context of the report that we've been talking about, and that could be problematic. I do think, however, that a lot of the research that does exist comes from the United States, and we don't understand the nature of stigma in Canada. And racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, these things are historically contextual. So whatever is done in the United States isn't necessarily replicable in Canada, and that we need the data here to be able to move through effectively. On another point, our work on, we call it the pipeline study, looking at conferences, textbooks, awards that are delivered to exceptional work within entrepreneurship, the entire ecosystem that drives productive work or creative work, in a sense, needs reimagining. We need to find entry and exit points in which we can talk about queerness, sexuality within business. Where do we introduce those along the pipeline? So within classrooms, put it on syllabi, maybe even extending departments so that there can be more cross-departmental training for folks within business. The data is going to help us do this. Right now, we examined, I can't even remember the number of textbooks, business textbooks, but there is nothing in there that is of importance for queer people right now. So we can see that's an entry point for scholarship to enter in and start having those conversations. We excavated journals, like I believe it was the top 3 business journals in Canada, and minuscule information on what those dynamics look like. And I go back to that image study that we've been doing. because the interesting thing about the beautiful presentation about queerness is that when we look under the carpet of the image that governments present and look at the comments in there, the hashtags, the people that are sharing and so on, we see violence. So it's showing up in the research because it's part of our lives, but it shouldn't be the only thing that shows up. But I'm suggesting that, Canada has this beautiful, shiny image of queer people and multiculturalism. But when we look in those comments, and we can tell the Canadian comments from the non-Canadian comments, they use, nationalistic emojis like the Canadian flag, hashtags, and self-bios within their profiles. And so this tells us a bit more about people who live within the country and are interested in communicating about how they feel queer people should be included within this country. But those comment sections are revealing.
I want to go back a bit to what you said about queerness and sexuality and business. And if you think sexuality and business, it's kind of an oxymoron because you don't talk about sexuality in a business school. Like, you don't talk about that. It seems very, very taboo. And that's part of the reason why queer people have been excluded from the workplace, period. And queer research in business has been excluded because it's just, why would we study this? It's not relevant, or it's taboo, or it's a stigma. And so part of it is changing that conversation of why we're relevant. We have family structures, we have disclosure. Sexuality is absolutely part of the business conversation.
And even when we were starting this project, there's this conversation, well, like, why do we need this project? We already have the Women's Entrepreneurship Hub, right? So that should cover everything, right? Which was, again, really telling and really important because this understanding that the kind of everybody's experience is the same, right? And I think that's a great point you bring up, Micah, too. And I just want to say this because we exist in a world in US and Canada and Alberta right now, where there is this pushback towards conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion. Again, this idea, we don't need this because, again, we're being fooled through conversations of, we include everybody, we're there. And this conversation about textbooks and not talking about sexuality in business is a perfect illustration about why we can't just assume everybody's experience is the same and that this isn't, and people's, the intersections in which people exist aren't relevant in any kind of, other conversation.
Well, and obviously sexuality and gender, right? Yeah. We have the Women's Entrepreneurship Hub that should cover gender, but as queer people, we have a multiplicity of gender and gender performances, and how women perform gender. They face certain barriers, but as queer people, how we perform gender and that intersection with sexuality is obviously extremely different.
Yes. And that makes me think of something that I thought was amazing that happened yesterday at a conference at U of T, of all places, where someone in their positionality statement, a two-spirit human, also introduced their family as having 2 husbands and 2 dogs. And I thought, these are the realities of our communities, showing up in our full lives, in our full existence, in our full family and kinship structures.
And traditionally in business, we don't think about the person and the whole person. And this is, again, another finding that has come up. It's not just entrepreneurship as product market fit and competition, but it's who you are as a person, how you show up in the room. We take for granted if you're a cishet white male, you're the default. You don't think about how you show up in the room. But obviously your personal life is a big, big deal, even in your professional life. And we saw this a lot in the more rural and the smaller communities about how there is a blending and an integration of personal and professional, because they do consider this holistic orientation to the person and not just your economic dimensions, how much money you're making, but how much resilience do you have as part of the business process, as part of your entrepreneurial journey.
And I think that's one thing that queer community aspires to and really does do well, that we do have a political feeling about where the money goes, about supporting each other, supporting communities. And so when we know and introduce our families, our people, then we're able to share the resources through those networks.
Looking ahead over the next 5 years, what does success look like for Rekh Csea, and what kind of systemic change do you hope to see as a result of this work?
I envision something similar to the Scarborough Charter that was developed, I believe, in 2020. And the Scarborough Charter was developed to basically, I believe it was 50 universities and colleges across Canada signed the charter to hire more Black and Indigenous scholars so that students can actually be opened up to more diverse ways of thinking. I think if we apply a similar sort of method to the entrepreneurship ecosystem, then business schools across Canada can also do something similar where they hire Black, Indigenous, trans scholars to actually deliver the work on sexual diversity and sexual inclusion within entrepreneurship, because currently that ecosystem is ill-equipped to lead that change.
Biggest changes that needs to happen is the normalizing of conversations around sexual and gender diversity. And this starts from childhood on. If we want to see changes in the working world for people, we have to change the experiences of kids who are starting out today in daycares, in preschool, in K-12. We have to not unintentionally other our communities like we do with so many people and their experiences. This idea that we have to give special consideration in some way, because that devalues. It means that you're only included because we have to. And it's kind of this pat on the head thing where their focus needs to be on what we bring to the table. This conversation was had globally, some years ago about what the impact would be on global poverty if women had equity across countries, right? We think about that. If people had equity across our country, across others, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality, sexual orientation, what would that do to us if you want to think about it from a business lens? What would that do economically for our country? Great things, right? But this is not something that we can talk about for half an hour. What we know is that true attitude change only comes from repeated positive direct exposure. It can't always be from this deficit and suffering lens that people talk about us, about our communities, right? It's about what we bring to the table and just, including us across conversations, across disciplines.
From the academic business school side of things, I'm thinking, what can I take away from this Rainbow Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub from queer experiences into the business school? And one of the things is redefining entrepreneurship. And I feel that's a very ambitious goal, but that's what we're learning as alternative models for entrepreneurship in general. And how does this translate to other communities? How does this translate into the business world, into the business classrooms? What can we learn from the queer community to expand into the business community and really develop alternative economic models for how we structure entrepreneurship in general?
I think success would be a transition or focus on constitutional morality. And what I mean by that is that when issues on queer inclusion arises, the focus needs to be placed on their constitutional right, not because somebody's moral capacity doesn't like it or it doesn't fit into someone's, cultural beliefs. We have to go back to the founding sort of core of our democracy, and that is our constitutional right. Same with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Those things aren't just nice to haves. It's our democratic right, and success will continue to push that. And that success, I think, would be reflected in the appropriate funds to deliver the immense work that this community needs right now.
Yes, and I thank you all, and I am inspired by all of you to say that when we know that the most vulnerable people in our population and communities who are Black and Indigenous, queer and trans femme identifying folks are able to run their businesses and their lives safely, live and thrive, then we'll know we're doing a great job.
And when we don't need a project like this.
Yes, exactly.
To make that happen.
Yes.
Work ourselves out of a job.
Yes, the goal of every activist is to run themselves out of business.
It should be.
Yes.
It should be. Yeah.
We'd like to thank Jared Wesley and Seon Yuzyk of the Community-Based Research Team, Michael Lounsbury and Micah Rajunov of the Academic Research Team, Randy Wimmer of the Scoping Review Team, Jillian Robinson of the Francophone Research Team, all of our research and support teams at the University of Alberta, the Advisory Council, and all the project teams and partners and the national lands. This was recorded and produced by Danny Ramez at Half Moon Audio.